November 13, 1942, 01:48 hours, Iron Bottom Sound, Guadalcanal. A searchlight beam cut through the tropical night as Captain Tameichi Hara gripped the rail of destroyer Ama. He watched in horrified disbelief as American shells erupted around his ship, a volcanic storm of steel and fire. "They are not aiming," he scribbled later in his logbook. "They are simply filling the sky with metal." That hurried line captured a truth most Japanese officers had not yet realized. The Pacific War would not be decided by tactics alone, but by the industrial weight behind the guns. In just 35 seconds, the cruiser USS San Francisco unleashed more 5-inch shells than some Japanese destroyers carried for an entire mission. The Americans were not counting rounds. They were building walls of fire, turning night into day. Their gun barrels glowing red from constant firing. Far away, in Pearl Harbor, ammunition ships were already being loaded 15,000 tons of shells, enough to replace what the fleet fired in this battle 50 times over. In Tokyo, naval planners debated whether they could even afford to allocate 12 rounds per gun for the next convoy. The mathematics of defeat were written not in strategy, but in brass casings, cordite smoke, and production figures that mocked every Imperial Navy assumption about fighting the United States. Captain Tameichi Hara would survive, the only Japanese destroyer commander to fight from Pearl Harbor to the final surrender. He witnessed not only the destruction of ships, but the shattering of the Imperial Navy's entire worldview. The awakening had actually begun months earlier, though few recognized it at the time. On May 7, 1942, at the Battle of the Coral Sea, Commander Teishi Nato, executive officer aboard the carrier Shokaku, noticed something unsettling. American cruisers and destroyers poured out anti-aircraft fire for 4 relentless hours, never pausing, never conserving ammunition. Later, under interrogation, he confessed his shock. Each American destroyer seemed to carry more anti-ammunition than our entire destroyer division combined. The observation seemed almost impossible. For decades, Japanese naval doctrine had been built on the assumption that every navy in the world faced the same limitations of ammunition supply. The standard 25mm Type 96 anti-aircraft gun, Japan's main light AA weapon, came with strict firing protocols. Gunners were trained to hold fire until enemy aircraft closed within 800 meters, fire only in short bursts of 3 to 5 rounds, and immediately cease fire once the target passed optimal range. This wasn't because it was tactically superior, it was because ammunition stocks simply could not support anything else. Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okamura, serving aboard the carrier Riri, had drilled his men endlessly in these principles. They knew that the ship's magazines held just enough shells for 12 minutes of continuous anti-aircraft fire. Beyond that, they would be helpless. But what unnerved Okamura was what he saw from the Americans. Their ships fired continuously, hour after hour, without pause, without restraint. It wasn't until Guadalcanal, however, that the true consequences of this imbalance became undeniable. There, the mathematics of industrial warfare would be carved into blood and steel. In the waters that came to be called Iron Bottom Sound, months earlier, on February 27, 1942, during the Battle of the Java Sea, Japanese forces won a clear tactical victory. Captain Hara, commanding the destroyer Amatsukaze, should have felt pride. The Allied fleet, a combined American, British, Dutch, and Australian force under Rear Admiral Carroll Dorman, had suffered heavily. 2 cruisers and 3 destroyers went to the bottom. Yet something disturbed Hara more than any enemy gunfire. In his after-action report, he noted that the Allied ships had fired an astonishing 1,619 rounds of 8-inch shells during the battle, scoring only 5 hits, 4 of them duds. Japanese gunnery had been far more accurate, but what shocked him was the sheer volume of Allied fire. They never seemed to stop. They showed no concern for ammunition expenditure, maintaining a relentless rate of fire that would have emptied Japanese magazines within the first hour. They fired, Hara later wrote in his memoir, as if they had unlimited shells. Poor gunnery, yes, but such wealth of ammunition that accuracy became secondary to volume. After the victory, as the wardroom celebrated, Hara overheard a troubling conversation. His gunnery officer, Lieutenant Yoshida, had been calculating their ammunition expenditure. "Captain, we've used 40% of our main battery ammunition." If the battle had lasted another 2 hours, Hara silenced him with a glance. But the arithmetic was undeniable. Amatsukaze had begun the battle with 2,000 rounds of 5-inch ammunition. They had used 800 in a single engagement. By contrast, the destroyed Allied cruiser HMS Exeter, according to rescued survivors, had fired over 1,500 rounds from her 8-inch guns alone. More ammunition than most Japanese heavy cruisers carried for their entire deployment. The lesson was grimly clear. Japanese ships fought with precision because they had to. The Allies, however, fought with volume because they could. When American forces came ashore on Guadalcanal, the Imperial Navy's greatest weakness was laid bare: ammunition. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's striking force, racing south from Rabaul, carried just enough shells for a single night engagement. This wasn't a tactical decision, it was all the ammunition that existed in Rabal's magazines. On the night of August 9, 1942, the Battle of Savo Island seemed like a stunning vindication of Japanese doctrine. In just 33 minutes, Mikawa's cruisers and destroyers sent 4 Allied heavy cruisers to the bottom, killing over 1,000 sailors. The Japanese lost not a single ship. To many it appeared a flawless victory, but beneath that triumph lay a devastating truth. Commander Toshikazu Omi, Mikawa's operations officer, later revealed to American interrogators, "We withdrew immediately after the battle, not from fear of your air attack, as you believed, but because we had exhausted most of our ammunition. We had nothing left for a second engagement." That decision spared the American transports anchored nearby defenseless ships packed with men, weapons, and supplies that could have been annihilated. The Japanese simply did not have the shells to fire at them. In that single night, MiG force expended 471 rounds, scoring 10 hits, a 2.1% hit rate that Tokyo would later criticize as wasteful. Yet while Japan calculated every shell fired, across the Pacific a very different picture was unfolding at Pearl Harbor. Captain William Poco Smith supervised the loading of the ammunition ship USS Rainier. Her manifest for just one voyage included 5,000 tons of naval ordnance, 350,000 rounds of 5-inch shells, 1.2 million rounds of 40 mm and over 3 million rounds of 20 mm. That single ship carried more ammunition than the entire Japanese combined fleet would expend in the next 3 months of combat. The imbalance was no longer tactical, it was industrial, and it was decisive. The famous Tokyo Express high-speed destroyer runs to resupply Guadalcanal exposed the Imperial Navy's ammunition crisis in painful detail. On November 30, 1942, Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka led 8 destroyers on yet another desperate supply mission. Captured documents later revealed the cargo manifest 1,100 drums of rice, 200 drums of medical supplies, and for 15,000 exhausted soldiers on Guadalcanal, only 280 drums of ammunition. Each drum held about 300 rifle cartridges, or an equivalent weight of other munitions. The arithmetic was brutal. The entire Japanese garrison was surviving on ammunition shipments that a single American destroyer could expend in just 20 minutes of combat. Captain Hara, commanding a Matsukaze on these runs, recorded his frustration in his memoir. "We risk 8 destroyers, dozens of lives, and tons of fuel to deliver what the Americans probably waste in target practice." He was more right than he knew. That very same day, the destroyer USS Fletcher carried out a routine gunnery exercise firing 127 rounds of 5-inch shells. In other words, half a drum of Tanaka's precious cargo was expended by the Americans without a second thought, and not even in battle. For Japanese planners, the numbers were staggering, incomprehensible. Their entire war effort had been calculated against their own limited industrial capacity. But America's production base was operating on a completely different scale. In March 1943, the Naval Ammunition Depot at Hastings, Nebraska began operations, built across 48,000 acres of prairie, with more than 2,200 buildings and over 200 miles of railroad track. It employed 10,000 workers at peak production. This single facility would go on to supply 40% of the U.S. Navy's total ammunition. During the war, its specialty was the 5-inch 38 caliber shell, the backbone of American destroyer and cruiser firepower. In its first month alone, Hastings produced more naval ammunition than Japan's entire military industry would manufacture for the rest of 1943. By September, its output had surged to over 300,000 rounds per month. This was the reality of industrial warfare, and it was a war Japan was never equipped to win. Every single round produced in America was inspected, tested, and shipped through a quality control system so strict that the rejects alone outnumbered the total ammunition produced by Japanese factories. At the same time, another giant came online, the Naval Ammunition Depot at McAlester, Oklahoma. Its specialty was larger caliber shells and aerial bombs. By December 1943, its monthly output included over 50,000 6-inch shells, 120,000 8-inch shells, 200,000 5-inch rounds, and 500,000 pounds of aerial ordnance. At its wartime peak, the facility employed 8,600 workers. Meanwhile in Japan, the contrast could not have been sharper. The Kure Naval Arsenal, the nation's premier ammunition factory, struggled to produce 10,000 shells of all calibers. In an entire month, the Toyokawa Naval Arsenal, expanded at enormous cost in 1940, managed to reach a peak of 35,000 machine guns and 4.5 million rounds of small arms ammunition per month. But that output depended on 56,000 workers, including 6,000 schoolchildren between the ages of 12 and 16, conscripted to work under hazardous conditions. This imbalance of firepower reached its most dramatic demonstration on June 19, 1944. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa led 9 Japanese carriers with 473 aircraft into what Tokyo hoped would be the decisive confrontation of the Pacific War. Opposing him, Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded 15 American carriers and 956 aircraft. But the true difference was not just in numbers, it was in ammunition. The American fleet sailed with magazines so vast that Ozawa could scarcely imagine them. Ammunition to the Americans was not a limitation. It was a weapon in itself. Lieutenant Sadamo Takahashi, flying a Zero fighter from the carrier, survived being shot down and later described his approach to the American task force. The sky turned black with explosions, not aimed shots, a solid wall of fire. They were not trying to hit us specifically. They were filling every cubic meter of air with steel. The Americans fired with mechanical precision. Every American gun spoke with industrial fury. The 5-inch mounts hammered out 15 rounds per minute. Each 40mm Bofors mount poured 120 rounds per minute. The 20mm cannons unleashed a staggering 450 rounds per minute. In just 6 hours of combat, the destroyer USS Stockholm alone expended 12,000 rounds of 40mm ammunition and another 20,000 rounds of 20mm. From above, Commander David McCampbell, the Navy's top ace, watched the spectacle from his Hellcat fighter. The Japs flew into a curtain of fire. He later recalled, "Our ships weren't aiming at individual planes. They were creating zones of death that nothing could fly through." The results were devastating. Japanese aircraft losses reached 476, including those lost when their carriers went down. American losses 29 aircraft. Ammunition expenditure told the story: minus 200,000 rounds of 5-inch shells, 500,000 rounds of 40mm, and over 1.2 million rounds of 20mm. Among the few Japanese pilots rescued, their testimony was chillingly concise. It was not battle, it was execution by machinery. Then came October 25, 1944, 0658 hours, off Samar Island, Philippines. The legendary David versus Goliath encounter was about to unfold. The Battle of Samar. Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force bore down with overwhelming might for battleships. 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Their target task unit 77.43, known as Taffy 3. Just 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and for destroyer escorts, the mismatch was staggering. But on the destroyer, USS Johnston, Commander Ernest Evans didn't hesitate. His orders rang out. All hands to general quarters. Prepare to attack major Japanese fleet units. All engines ahead, flank. Left full rudder. Charging into the maw of the enemy fleet, Johnston's gunners opened fire. In less than an hour, they hurled over 200 rounds of 5-inch shells into the heavy cruiser Kumano, smashing her superstructure with 40 direct hits. Then they turned on the battleship Kongu, loosing another 30 rounds while laying down smoke. They weren't carefully aiming, they were firing at maximum rate, saturating their targets with steel. Meanwhile, aboard the destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland gave his men the order, "We're going in, boys. This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected." What he didn't tell them was that Samuel B. Roberts carried only 325 rounds per gun, minus 1,625 rounds total. Yet in just 35 minutes, one gun mount alone fired more than 600 rounds, nearly 40% of the ship's entire magazine, the barrels glowing white-hot from the strain. Gunner's mate 3rd Class Paul H. Carr, captain of Mount 52, kept his weapon blazing even after the power failed, manually firing until his station was consumed by flames. This was the industrial war in its purest form. American ships burning through ammunition at impossible rates, transforming desperation into defiance. Gunner's mate Paul H. Carr and his crew managed to manually load and fire 6 more rounds before disaster struck. A catastrophic explosion tore through the mount. When rescuers later found Carr, he was dying, still clutching a final 5-inch shell in his arms, desperately trying to load it into the ruined gun. On the Japanese side, the battle brought another first. The battleship Yamato, the most powerful warship ever built, fired her massive 18.1-inch guns against surface targets for the first and only time in history. Dozens of shells thundered across the water, but her magazines were filled with armor-piercing rounds designed to penetrate the thick armor of enemy battleships against the lightly built escort carriers of Taffy 3. The shells passed straight through without exploding. Admiral Matomi Ugaki, commanding Battleship Division 1, wrote in his diary that night, "The enemy destroyers charged through their own smoke, firing continuously. Such expenditure of ammunition for such small ships. It defies calculation." The numbers told the truth. American ships expended approximately 20,000 rounds of all calibers. The Japanese barely 3,000. The result, despite overwhelming superiority, Kurita's fleet withdrew. In their wake lay 2 American destroyers, 1 destroyer escort, and 1 escort carrier, but 3 Japanese heavy cruisers were left burning and shattered from American gunfire. This was the reality of the production war. By late 1944, U.S. ammunition output had reached a scale that defied Japanese comprehension. The sheer numbers were staggering. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States produced 47 billion rounds of small arms ammunition. 41.4 billion of them rifle and pistol cartridges. As one general remarked, it was enough to give every person on Earth 10 bullets. Monthly figures for November 1944 alone were mind-bending. 3.5 billion rounds of small arms ammunition. 1.2 million 5-inch shells. 8 million 40mm rounds. 20 million 20mm rounds. 10,000 16-inch shells. 15,000 14-inch shells. 40 8-inch shells. 60,000 6-inch shells. This was not just production. It was an arsenal on a scale never before seen in human history. By the end of the war, Japan's total ammunition output across all calibers and types barely reached 15 million rounds. To put that into perspective, the U.S. Navy's Crane Ammunition Depot in Indiana alone dwarfed Japan's entire effort. Spread across 63,000 acres, employing 10,000 workers. Crane stored its stockpile in over 2,000 underground magazines. Its total capacity 400,000 tons of ammunition. That meant a single American depot held twice the reserves the entire Imperial Japanese Navy possessed at the start of the war. In December 1941, Japan's total reserves were only 200,000 tons, and that had to supply an empire fighting across half the Pacific. The contrast in the human dimension was equally stark. In Hastings, Nebraska, American workers lived in dormitories built for them, ate meals in massive cafeterias serving 15,000 meals a day, and enjoyed bowling alleys, movie theaters, and schools for their children, all inside the ammunition plant. It was not just a factory, it was a city built for war production. Meanwhile, in Japan's Toyokawa Naval Arsenal, children were forced into dangerous labor. 12-year-old Akiko Sato worked 12-hour shifts filling shell casings. In her memoir, she recalled, "We were always hungry at lunch. They gave us only one rice bowl. We worked until we collapsed. Many of my classmates died in accidents. In our section, we produced maybe 100 shells in a day. The Americans probably fired that many in a single second." This disparity created a vicious cycle that accelerated Japan's defeat. Ammunition shortages crippled training. Pilots and gunners were forced to hoard every round for combat, leaving little for practice. Japan's leading surviving ace, Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, would later reveal just how devastating this was. By 1944, the difference in training between Japanese and American pilots had become catastrophic. In 1941, Japanese aviators averaged over 700 hours of flight training before combat, but by the war's later years, new pilots received barely 40 to 60 hours. Worse still was gunnery practice. Where once gunners trained extensively, by 1944 many recruits fired fewer than 100 practice rounds before being thrown into battle. The Americans lived in another world. At Naval Air Station Pensacola, trainees fired an average of 5,000 rounds during advanced fighter training alone. Ammunition was never rationed. A struggling pilot simply fired more until his accuracy improved. Throughout the war, American aviators averaged 400 to 525 hours of flight training, a standard that Japan could no longer dream of matching. Ensign Koshiro Ito, trained in late 1944, described the grim reality. "I fired my guns exactly 3 times before combat, 10 rounds each time, 30 rounds total. In my first battle, the American I faced probably fired 30 rounds in the first second." For anti-aircraft gunners, the situation was even more desperate. Japanese doctrine demanded holding fire until enemy planes closed within 800 meters, practically point-blank range for aircraft moving at 300 miles per hour. The reason was simple. Beyond that distance, hit probability dropped below 0.5%. Ammunition was too precious to waste. American training, once again, was the opposite. Seaman First Class Robert Scott, a 20mm gunner aboard USS New Jersey, recalled, "We fired at everything. Tow targets, balloons, floating barrels. I must have fired 50,000 rounds in training. The first time I saw a Japanese plane, muscle memory took over. I didn't think about ammunition. I just filled the sky with lead where he needed to fly." Behind this confidence stood an unprecedented logistics revolution. Task Force 38 was supplied by Service Squadron 10, a mobile fleet of oilers, ammunition ships, refrigerated supply vessels, repair tenders, hospital ships, and escort carriers for replacement aircraft. On July 21 to 22, 1945, Task Group 30.8 carried out what may have been the largest at-sea replenishment in history. In a single operation, they delivered 6,369 tons of ammunition, nearly 380,000 barrels of fuel oil, 1,600 tons of provisions, 99 aircraft, and 421 fresh personnel. This one replenishment mission delivered more ammunition than many Japanese naval bases possessed in their entire inventory after the war. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, admitted, "We calculated American consumption based on our own limits. If we could afford 1,000 rounds for an operation, we assumed they might have 3,000. The reality that they had 100,000 was beyond imagination." April 6, 1945. The final and most desperate gamble of the Japanese Navy was about to begin. Operation Tengo, The final suicidal sortie of the battleship Yamato became the most tragic demonstration of Japan's ammunition crisis. When she left port, Yamato carried 1,170 shells for her 9 colossal 18.1-inch guns, minus 130 per gun, essentially a full combat load. For her 6.1-inch secondary batteries, 1,629 rounds. For her anti-aircraft weapons, just 13,500 rounds. This was not merely her loadout, it was, in reality, every suitable shell Japan had left to give her. Even then it was not enough. Her secondary batteries carried only 60% of their standard ammunition. Her anti-aircraft guns could sustain a full barrage for just 12 minutes before departure. Captain Kasaku Aruga gathered his crew and told them plainly, "We sail with enough ammunition for one battle. There will be no resupply. Use every round wisely." On April 7, 1945, Yamato met her fate. Wave after wave of American aircraft descended, minus 386 planes in all. The first wave reported, "Target is throwing up tremendous AA fire." But by the third wave, the volume of fire had dropped sharply. By the fifth, it was sporadic. Ensign Mitsuru Yoshida, one of the few survivors, recalled the ship's final moments. The 25mm guns fell silent first, no ammunition, then the 127mm guns. Finally, even the great main battery had nothing left. We were a 70,000-ton target, nothing more. Across the ocean, the contrast was staggering. The American carriers launching the strikes had been fully replenished only 72 hours earlier. USS Essex alone received 500 tons of ammunition in that resupply, the equivalent of 400,000 rounds of various calibers. During the attack on Yamato, her air group expended 200,000 rounds of .50 caliber machine gun ammunition, knowing with certainty that tomorrow's replenishment would replace it all. Japan's ammunition shortage rippled far beyond the battlefield. By 1944, a critical copper shortage essential for shell casings forced nationwide collection drives. Ancient temple bells, some dating back to the 8th century, were torn from their towers and melted down. Bronze statues, national treasures, household pots, even door handles were requisitioned. Between 1937 and 1945, Japan melted down over 45,000 Buddhist temple bells, 90% of the nation's total. Each one weighed hundreds of kilograms, composed of 85% copper and up to 15% tin, perfect material for shell casings. What had once called monks to prayer now fed the desperate furnaces of war. 13-year-old Yukio Tanaka wrote in her diary, "They took our school bell today for ammunition." Teacher Yamamoto cried. He said the bell had rung for 200 years. How many shells will it make? How many seconds will those shells last in battle? The answer was devastating. A typical temple bell weighed 500 kilograms and could yield enough brass for about 2,000 small caliber shell casings. Yet on the battlefield, an American destroyer's 40mm mount could fire that many rounds in just 16 minutes of combat. Centuries of history melted for a few fleeting minutes of firepower. Meanwhile, conditions inside Japan's arsenals collapsed into tragedy. At the Toyokawa Naval Arsenal, accident rates reached 15% per month by 1945. Exhausted children worked with explosives they barely understood. On August 7, 1945, a B-29 raid obliterated the facility, killing 2,477 workers, most of them teenagers. The contrast with America was staggering. At Hastings, Nebraska, Mary Roberts assembled shells under safe and structured conditions. We worked 8-hour shifts, 5 days a week. Good pay, $1.20 an hour. Hot meals in the cafeteria. They showed movies every Friday. We knew we were winning the war, one shell at a time. By this stage, American tactics themselves had evolved to exploit their overwhelming ammunition advantage. While Japanese doctrine revolved around conserving shells, the U.S. Navy developed strategies built around expenditure without limit. Admiral Willis Ching Lee, the Navy's foremost surface warfare tactician, pioneered the concept of area saturation fire for night battles. Instead of carefully aimed salvos, American ships would pour fire into entire zones, transforming the sea into killing grounds where evasion was impossible. At the Battle of Surigao Strait on October 25, 1944, this doctrine reached its climax. Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's battle line unleashed a storm of steel, 285 16-inch shells, 310 14-inch shells, and thousands of 8-inch and 6-inch rounds, all in just 18 minutes. The Battle of Surigao Strait sealed the fate of Japan's surface fleet. The battleships Fusu and Yamashiro, sailing with reduced ammunition loads to conserve weight, managed to fire fewer than 100 shells combined before being annihilated. Lieutenant Commander Tokuno Horashi, one of Yamashiro's few survivors, later recalled, "Shells fell like rain. Not aimed at us specifically, they simply filled the strait with explosions. We fired back into the darkness, but for every shell we sent, 50 came back." As Japanese arsenals emptied, their tactics turned to desperation. The special attack units, the kamikaze, represented the ultimate, tragic consequence of ammunition shortage. When shells became too precious to fire, the weapon became the pilot himself. Vice Admiral Takejiro Nishi, the architect of the kamikaze corps, admitted privately, "We resort to body crashing because we lack the ammunition for conventional attack. One piloted one plane replaces hundreds of shells we do not have." American codebreakers soon uncovered the depth of this crisis. A decrypted Japanese naval report from December 1944 revealed the grim truth: 16-inch ammunition, 15% of required, minimum 14-inch 22%, 8-inch 18%, 5-inch 31%, anti-aircraft ammunition, critical shortage, all carriers. Admiral Chester Nimitz, reading the report, summed it up with brutal clarity. "They're a boxer with no punch left. We just keep hitting until they fall." From that point forward, American planners began designing operations not only to achieve objectives but to bleed Japanese magazines dry. Feint attacks, harassment raids, probing strikes, each designed to force Japan to waste ammunition. It could never replace Commander Joseph Rochefort. The legendary cryptanalyst explained it simply: "We could predict Japanese operations by their ammunition requisitions. When they requested resupply, we knew they couldn't fight for at least 2 weeks. We owned the timing of every battle." Meanwhile, beneath the waves, American submarines were delivering the final blow. Japanese ammunition convoys became prime targets. The results were catastrophic. 147 Japanese ammunition ships sunk, 500,000 tons of ammunition lost at sea, 55% of all shipments destroyed before reaching their destinations. One of the most famous kills came in January 1943, when Lieutenant Commander Dudley Mushmorton and his submarine USS Wahoo intercepted and sank the ammunition ship Fukumaru. With every sinking, Japan's firepower slipped further beyond recovery. The destruction was sometimes apocalyptic. When one Japanese ammunition ship exploded, the blast was visible from 40 miles away. That single ship carried more shells than the entire Rabaul garrison would receive in the next 3 months. Captain Tatsuoka Shimazaki, commander of an ammunition convoy, described the hopelessness. "We loaded at Kure with 10,000 tons of shells for a ball for ships. By the time we arrived, 2 were sunk, 1 was crippled. We delivered 2,000 tons. The submarines took the rest." For Japanese logisticians, the strain was unbearable. Commander Yoshiro Tanaka, tasked with ammunition distribution in the Philippines, took his own life in October 1944 after failing to deliver critical supplies. His last note read, "I send empty ships to die. The Americans sink them full or empty. Our guns fall silent while there's never stop." By war's end, the production numbers told the whole story. U.S. naval ammunition production: 1,941, 1,945 to 47 billion rounds. Total: 4.2 million tons in weight. Peak monthly output: 3.5 billion rounds. March 1945.47 Major facilities: nearly 500,000 workers. Japan, 1941 to 1,945, 15 million rounds. Total: 200,000 tons in weight. Peak monthly output: 400,000 rounds. November 1942, 11 facilities, 95,000 workers, many of them conscripted children. The disparity exceeded 3,000 to 1 in small arms ammunition alone, and quality made the gap even wider. American proximity fuses, introduced in 1943, increased anti-aircraft effectiveness by 300 to 600%. Japanese fuses, degraded by poor materials, failed nearly 1/3 of the time. By 1945, this imbalance reshaped psychology on both sides. For American sailors, endless ammunition meant boundless confidence. Seaman James Bradley of USS Laffey recalled, "We never worried about running out. The supply ships came every few days, mountains of shells. We joked we could shoot at seagulls for practice and nobody would care." That confidence translated into audacity. Destroyers charged battleships. PT boats attacked cruisers. David could face Goliath because David had unlimited stones. For Japanese sailors, the reverse was true. Lieutenant Kazuhiko Ono, gunnery officer of Isokaze, admitted, "Every shell fired required justification. We counted rounds like a miser counts coins. In battle, part of your mind always calculated, can I afford this shot?" That hesitation was fatal. The most devastating psychological blow came not in battle but in captivity. Commander Tameichi Fukuda, captured after his destroyer sank, was transferred to Pearl Harbor aboard USS New Jersey. There he watched the battleship fire 400 rounds in training. He later confessed, "I wept, not from shame of capture, but from realization we never had a chance. They fired more shells in practice than we carried into battle. How do you fight such wealth?" The disparity reflected deeper economic truths. America's gross national product in 1944 reached $210 billion. Japan's was $20 billion, and ammunition revealed the gulf most clearly. U.S. copper production for shell casings, 450,000 tons annually, Japan's entire copper supply for military and civilian use combined, 80,000 tons. ANNUALLYUS lead. 4 bullets, 380,000 tons annually. Japan's lead ore uses 25,000 tons annually. The United States produced more copper for bullets alone than Japan produced for its entire war economy. And then came the technological edge. The proximity fuse, developed at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, transformed air defense. Instead of requiring a direct hit, shells now exploded automatically when radar detected they were near a target. The program cost $1 billion, equal to 5% of Japan's entire gross national product in 1944. The proximity fuse was America's third most expensive weapons program of the war, behind only the Manhattan Project at $2 billion, and the B-29 program at $3 billion. Unlike anything Japan could dream of building, each fuse required precision miniaturized vacuum tubes capable of surviving 20,000 times the force of gravity when fired from a gun barrel. By war's end, America had manufactured over 22 million of them. The first combat test came on January 5, 1943, when USS Helena shot down a Japanese dive bomber with her second salvo. From that day forward, the skies tilted in America's favor. Anti-aircraft effectiveness leapt by 300 to 600%. Japanese commanders could hardly believe what they saw. Admiral Koshi Hagawa, watching a raid in 1945, wrote, "The American shells explode by magic, knowing when they approach our aircraft. Each detonation is perfectly placed. This is not warfare, it is witchcraft by mathematics." But it wasn't magic, it was technology. American ships carried the Mark 37 fire control system as standard equipment, gyroscopic stabilization, automatic radar tracking, mechanical ballistic computers, servo-driven turrets, remote power control. Price tag $500,000 per system. More than the entire annual ammunition budget of a Japanese destroyer squadron. Japanese gunnery, by contrast, remained almost medieval. Optical rangefinders, manual calculations, human guesswork. Captain Toshiro Miura admitted with bitter clarity, "We aimed by eye while they aimed by machine. We guessed while they calculated." Every American shell was guided by mathematics. We could not match. The effect was staggering. Survival statistics began to defy military logic. On April 16, 1945, destroyer USS Laffey was attacked by 22 kamikazes for 80 minutes. Her guns never stopped. She fired 345 rounds of 5-inch, 11,000 rounds of 40 millimeters, 20,000 rounds of 20 millimeters. Her gunners shot down 9 aircraft outright and crippled for more that crashed elsewhere. Laffey absorbed 4 bomb hits and 6 kamikaze strikes and still lived. She survived because her magazines never ran dry. Now, compare that with the Japanese light cruiser Yahagi escorting Yamato on her final mission. Her anti-aircraft ammunition was gone in just 45 minutes. After that, she could only twist helplessly through the waves as American aircraft attacked without resistance. 7 torpedoes, 12 bombs, and then she capsized. The story of the USS Helena is another testament to the American arsenal. From Pearl Harbor in 1941 to her final battle in 1943, Helena fired over 10,600 rounds, 3,460 rounds of 5-inch shells, 7,179 rounds of 6-inch shells, a single cruiser. In less than 2 years, expended more heavy ammunition than some entire Japanese fleets managed in the same span. The USS Helena's story symbolized the truth of the Pacific War. Her nickname, the machine gun cruiser, came not from a single battle, but from years of relentless firing. Pearl Harbor, Guadalcanal, Kula Gulf. At Guadalcanal in November 1942, her guns roared so fast that Japanese observers thought she carried automatic 6-inch cannons, a weapon that did not even exist. Her fire rate exceeded what Japanese doctrine believed was physically possible. Captain Hara's remark captured more than just tactics when he observed, "The Americans fired without thinking while we counted every round." It revealed the war's fundamental nature. This was not a contest between equal powers with temporary advantages. This was industrial civilization crushing pre-industrial ambition. The final statistics remain staggering. American ammunition expended 47 billion rounds in total. For 1.4 billion rifle and pistol, Japanese ammunition expended about 15 million rounds. All types. Ratio over 3,100 to 1. But even these numbers understate reality. Americans fired not only in combat but in training, test firing, and harassment missions. Japanese gunners, by contrast, hoarded every shell until the moment of desperation. The US used ammunition to suppress, to intimidate, to dominate. Japan used it only when survival demanded. When Emperor Hirohito announced surrender on August 15, 1945, he spoke of a new and most cruel bomb. But within the Japanese Navy, leaders knew the truth. The atomic bomb only shortened a defeat already guaranteed. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, the Navy's last commander, admitted, "We could build ships without steel. We could fly planes without fuel, but we could not fight without ammunition." The Americans had infinite amounts. We had whatever we could salvage from our grandfathers' temples. The contrast between arsenals told the story best. On August 14, 1945, in the ruins of Kure Naval Arsenal, a final report was written. Daily production, 73 shells, worker strength, 423, half of them middle school, children. Status, critical shortage of all materials. That same day, at Hastings Naval Ammunition Depot in Nebraska, the report read, daily production, 45,000 shells, worker strength, 5,800, status, exceeding quota, recommend reduction due to expected war termination. The lesson could not be more stark. Wars between industrial powers are not decided by courage, skill, or even determination, though all matter. They are decided by the ability to transform raw materials into delivered destruction. Captain Hara, one of the few Japanese destroyer captains to survive the war, summarized it with haunting clarity. We brought swords to a machine gun fight, then wondered why we lost. The Americans didn't defeat our navy. Their factories did. Every shell they fired announced an industrial supremacy we could not imagine, much less match. The Pacific still holds the evidence, resting on its floor. Brass casings stamped with American ordnance marks. Each one tells the same story, that wars are not won by those who count shells, but by those who can afford not to count. For Japanese sailors, scarcity turned every bullet into a treasure. For Americans, abundance turned every bullet into confidence. Two gunners. 2 letters home. Capture the contrast more powerfully than statistics ever could. Ensign Teo Matsui, manning a 25mm mount aboard carrier Zuikaku, received 10 shells during the carrier's final battle. He wrote to his mother, I have 10 chances to protect my ship. I will make each one count. He died with all 10 shells still unfired, paralyzed by the arithmetic of scarcity at the same time. Seaman Robert Dixon, a 20mm gunner aboard USS Essex, wrote home after expending 15,000 rounds. Mom, you wouldn't believe how many bullets we shoot. It's like a fireworks show that never ends. Don't worry about me. We've got so much ammunition, nothing can get through. Both men were equally brave. Both fought with equal devotion, but one counted rounds while the other counted victories. And that difference was not about courage. It was about capacity, not about character, but about brass, not about determination, but about industrial might turned into firepower. 80 years later, the lesson endures. Military professionals still study Captain Hara's observation, not as a historical curiosity, but as eternal truth. Wars between industrial powers are won long before the battlefield. They are decided in the factories. The Pacific War proved a timeless truth. Once mobilized, industrial capacity creates military power that no amount of tactical brilliance can overcome. American shells fell like rain because American factories produced like storms. Japanese shells were counted like jewels because Japanese factories produced like artisans. In the end, Captain Tameichi Hara's words stand as epitaph for an empire that tried to challenge industrial mathematics with spiritual determination. The Americans fired without thinking, while we counted every round. In that difference lay not just tactical disadvantage, but strategic impossibility. Not just military defeat, but a civilizational reckoning with the arithmetic of modern war. The shells have long since stopped falling. The guns long since fallen silent. Yet the truth remains preserved in archives from Pearl Harbor to Yokosuka, and in the memoirs of sailors from Washington to Tokyo. The Pacific War was not decided by the courage of those who pulled the triggers, but by the capacity of those who made the shells. America could afford to fire without thinking. Japan could only afford to think without firing. Between those two realities lay the abyss that swallowed an empire's ambitions and reshaped the world's understanding of industrial war. The final testament comes not from admirals or historians, but from the numbers themselves, 47 billion to 15 million. That ratio tells the true story not of battles won or lost, but of an industrial colossus that produced more ammunition than the world had ever seen, against a nation that melted its temple bells to make a few more shells. The Americans fired without thinking because they could afford to. The Japanese counted every round because they had to. And in that difference, the war's outcome was written before the first shot was fired.